Hello and welcome back to my channel. On this video, I'm going to be talking about all of the books that I read in the month of April 2024, and I was able to get in 31 books this month. Now, I will give a bit of a caveat in that I did catch a bit of a flu virus at the latter part of this month, and there's a couple books that I read on audio during that period that I don't remember probably as well as I should because I just was under the weather and not feeling great. However, books always are just a great comfort for me, and so I was continuing to read during that period. But let's dive into the books that I read in April. So the first book that I picked up is one that I had due back at the library, and so I made a point to sit down and just read it. It's a novella called The Mistletoe Motive by Chloe Liese. Now, Chloe Liese is one of my favorite romance authors. She does an incredible job writing representations of disability and neurodiversity into her romances. This one was no different. It is a Christmas-themed novella, and I had had it since Christmas, and I needed to get it back to my library, and so I made a point to read it first thing this month. Really did enjoy that one. Then I picked up the fifth book in the Inspector Karen Pirie series. This is a series about a detective who works in a cold case office. And so there are often mysteries within the series that have a present day crime that is happening that is tied back to a cold case crime that is being solved. And this is the fifth of 7 books in the series. And I'm really enjoying this. It has also been adapted into a television show, and so I'm looking forward to watching that once I finished out the series. I also picked up a book called Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This is another book that I picked up because it has been adapted into a film, and I wanted to watch the film. I did watch the film after I read the book this month. And this is a romance novel where the premise is the first son of the President of the United States is having a romance with the Prince of England. And I thought the book was actually really fun. There were a ton of great side characters, and just the concept of this is really interesting. I also really enjoyed the film. I thought that it was very true to the book. There were a couple of changes that were made, understandable because it was simplifying, a little bit of like the familial relationships and things like that. But I did think they were both really fun. I also picked up a book called Listen for the Lie by Amy Tintera. And this is a book that has a podcasting kind of like subplot, which I always find really interesting. I feel like there are a lot of mysteries and thrillers recently that are including podcasting as kind of like a true crime, element, because there are so many podcasts that are true crime. But this is basically a book that is about a woman who has, like, earlier in her life, her best friend is murdered, and she's there when it happens, but she can't remember what has happened in this murder. And so there's always been this question kind of hanging over her if she was somehow involved in the death of her best friend. What ends up happening is a true crime podcaster is revisiting the situation, and she ends up actually participating in this podcast and trying to kind of understand what happened in the situation with her best friend. I really liked this. I thought it had some nice twists and turns. I'm always looking for, in a thriller or mystery, some components that I'm not seeing coming, and there were definitely a couple things in this one that I would put in that category. The next book I picked up is called Their Free Fall at Last. This is the 4th book in the Honeywood Romance Quartet by Julie Olivia, and this is the series of romances that are set in a theme park. And this particular romance, the trope is kind of like friends to lovers, childhood friends to lovers, really. It's a very long-term relationship, and it's a lengthy book, but I also feel like it has to go kind of back and forth to kind of show you the development of this relationship over time, and then what is happening in present day, which is basically that the male main character is getting married, and that is causing a bunch of tensions because the female main character is in love with this friend of hers, and so we're kind of trying to figure out how that's going to be resolved. I really did like this quartet overall, and I would absolutely recommend this series. The next book I picked up is a book called What the River Knows. This is the first book in the Secrets of the Nile series by Isabel Ibanez. I had picked this up because a ton of people were talking about it. It has definitely kind of like Egyptian themes. It's basically the story of a young girl who goes from Argentina to Egypt when her parents go missing, and her parents are in Egypt. And I think they're like archaeologists, or they're somehow involved in archaeology, and they go missing. And so she follows them to kind of find them. And this is not set in present day. This is a historically set novel. And once she gets there, she gets kind of sucked into a number of things that are happening with characters who are in Egypt, and is kind of trying to unravel the mystery of her parents. There's some magical elements to this book as well. I will say that while I felt like the book was very well written, it's also just kind of not for me. Like, there was something about it that it didn't hold my interest as much. I felt like some of the relationships with the main character and kind of what starts to unfold, later on in the book, felt a little convoluted to me. Some people just raved about this book though. So I think if it sounds interesting to you, you should definitely pick it up and try it out. I don't know that I'm going to be checking out later books in this particular series just because it wasn't really for me. The next book I picked up is a book called Second First Impressions by Sally Thorne. This is a romance novel about a man and a woman who meet because the woman works in kind of like an old folks home or like assisted living facility, and the man is hired as like an assistant there as well, and they begin to develop a relationship with each other. I will say with this particular book, I liked the second half better than I liked the first half. I felt like the first half, how some of the relationships were kind of coming together, I don't know, like it felt a little bit surface level to me. And then the further along we got in the book, the more depth I was seeing to the characters and to kind of their psychologies of like what was going on with things in their lives, and just appreciated that a little bit more. Next up, I picked up Cal Newport's Slow Productivity, The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. And I will say that Cal Newport is someone that I like to keep up with what he's writing about. He has a book on deep work, which I think a lot of people have really enjoyed. He has a book on email and kind of how we shouldn't be using it as much as we are. In this particular book, he does give a caveat basically in the beginning of the book that the kinds of things that he's recommending are really for people who have some level of control over their work lives and their schedules. And that is just not true for everyone, in terms of especially workers who are maybe below like a management level. Like they may not be able to kind of implement some of the things he's talking about. I also feel like one of the challenges with this particular author, he is an academic, he is at an Ivy League institution, and so some of the things that he has kind of incorporated into his life, like what he is known for, I don't know that they're always realistic for what other people can do. Now, I do think that this whole concept of trying to work without burnout is important for obvious reasons, but some of the kinds of things that he is addressing and talking about in this book, he's really set up a situation where this works for him, but I don't know that it has broad scale applicability to a lot of other areas of people's life and work. I feel like there's a small subset of people that this might be applicable to, and not kind of like the broad, population. Worth checking out if you want to see if there's like strategies or tactics that he's talking about in the book. I will say that one of the books I appreciated about him is one of his earliest books called So Good They Can't Ignore You, which I found to be a little bit more interesting than what I've seen him do in his later stuff. Okay, the next book I picked up was kind of a rabbit hole that I fell down in the month of April. It's called My Story by Elizabeth Smart. I stumbled back across Elizabeth Smart because she was on a podcast of somebody that I follow, and she's a runner. And this was about her being kind of a runner, on this podcast. And if you don't know who Elizabeth Smart is, in the early 2000s, when she was 14 years old, she was kidnapped out of her house, and she was held by this kidnapper and his wife for about 9 months before she was rescued. And this is a story basically about her captivity in this situation. And it started out in Utah, and eventually they go to California, and then they come back to Utah, and then she is found. This is a memoir that I think I will give trigger warnings. There is quite a bit of sexual assault that is happening in this memoir. Obviously, kind of harm of a child is also included here. I have seen kind of mixed reviews of the memoir in terms of the quality of the writing. And I would agree with that to some extent. This is clearly ghostwritten, and that's made clear, I think, in the authorship. At the same time, I was turning the pages. I just think this whole story of what happened to Elizabeth Smart is fascinating. The near misses of people who like almost rescued her during this period of time, and then for whatever reason, like it didn't work out. I mean, there's a situation in which she's in a library and there's a police officer that approaches them and she is still not rescued. I mean, like there's just, it's crazy. I mean, just to kind of like hear the story of what's going on. I definitely fell down like a Wikipedia rabbit hole of like whatever happened, you know, with the trial and the court case and, you know, all the things. And there's a couple other books that her parents have written and other people have written about this story, because it really did capture, you know, a lot of media attention in the early 2000s. So I don't read a lot of true crime, you know, kind of books, but this was one that I just kind of stumbled across because I saw this interview and thought it was really interesting. The next book I read is a book called The Sentence by Louise Erdrich. And Louise Erdrich is best known, I think, for writing as kind of a Native writer, a Native American writer, and she has a long backlist of several different books. This is a book that was part of my Alphabet Challenge. I've also heard many people say really positive things about it. And it's basically about a woman who has been incarcerated and then she gets out of prison, goes to work at a bookstore, and there is a haunting of the bookstore, and it's kind of the story of this haunting. And I will just say, I think Louise Erdrich is incredibly talented. This is definitely a book that falls into more kind of like literary fiction, if that's something that you're kind of looking for. And I know she's also done a lot of like short stories and other novels, and would definitely recommend this book as well as her backlist. Okay, next I'm going to talk about the box set that I read for this month, which was the 6 books in the Mortal Instruments series by Cassandra Clare. This is a book series that is kind of urban fantasy, which I haven't read a ton of, but I have not ever read Cassandra Clare before, and so I wanted to kind of dig into some of her work. And so I did read all 6 books in the series. And I feel like the best way to describe these books, and I actually think this is kind of a positive thing, is each book was kind of like a season of a television show in terms of like how it's packaged and like what's happening in the plot. So in the first book, and I'll just kind of give a little bit about that before, I don't want to go too far into the series because there'll be spoilers, but basically there is a teenage girl who is starting to realize that she has kind of a little bit of like paranormal like powers or magic, and she doesn't really understand what it is, and she kind of like stumbles upon what Cassandra Clare calls shadow hunters, which are basically people who hunt demons. And she starts to develop some relationships with like this group of people and understand her own kind of like parentage and background. And her mother goes missing, and we kind of understand that like her mother may have had some like secrets that she was keeping from the daughter, that explain a little bit more about the kinds of like powers and paranormal activity that she's like coming to understand that she has access to. And then each book in the series has like what I would say is a pretty contained plot. And that's what I mean by there's like, it's like seasons of a TV show where you could be like, in this season, this happens to the characters. And then in this next season, this happens to the characters. I will say that there were a couple things plot-wise in the first couple of books that I found to be a little bit hokey, but that's okay. I mean, this is like a young adult series, and I think it's just really, like it was interesting to visit this. Now, I will give kind of a spoiler alert that as I'm recording this, I'm a few days into May, and I've started reading the second trilogy by Cassandra Clare, which is called, Infernal Devices is what it's called. So this first one is Mortal Instruments, and then the next one is Infernal Devices. And it's a more historical, it's like a prequel to these 6 books in this first series. I am like gulping it down. Like I'm in on the second book already, and I'm really, really, really enjoying it. Probably more so than these first 6 books. So I like that I was like introduced to the whole concept of like what's going on here, but some of the other stuff that she's written a little bit later on, I'm really, really liking. So that is the Mortal Instruments box set by Cassandra Clare. Next up, I picked up a book called See You Yesterday by Rachel Lynn Solomon. This is a book that I had some skepticism about because it has kind of a Groundhog's Day trope, which is not typically my favorite. But basically what this is about is a girl who is going into college, And she starts to have kind of this Groundhog's Day where she wakes up every day and it's like the same day. But then she realizes there's someone else who's experiencing the same thing. And he's been experiencing this for quite some time. And they start to try to figure out what's going on so that they can try to like get themselves out of this like Groundhog's Day situation. This was another book that I felt like the beginning of it, like it needed some time to kind of warm up. But once I got into kind of like the middle and then what eventually happens towards the end of the book, I really did enjoy this. There are some kind of subplots that are happening with the main character and also the male main character that she ends up kind of partnering with to figure out this mystery that I really did enjoy. I feel like Rachel Lynn Solomon, she writes both adult romance and then also these kind of like young adult romances. I have really enjoyed everything that I've read from her so far and would definitely recommend it. All right, the next book that I had on my list is a book called Solitude, A Return to the Self by Anthony Storr. And this is a book that was part of my Alphabet Challenge as well. It is basically, I was thinking it was kind of like a memoir, but it's not. It's more of like a psychological defense of solitude as being like an important part of a person's life, using examples of like artists and scientists and a bunch of different people. I think this book was written, I don't know the original publication date. Let me see if it's in here. The one that I read was 2005, but this book I think was originally published in 1988. So it was an earlier written book. And what I would say is this is a book that you should expect has a lot of examples that are a little bit less diverse in terms of the author's choices. So a lot of white males basically is what is being used as examples in this book. And I found it interesting just to kind of note that this is like some of the early acknowledgement of this kind of thing. It's basically like using arguments from like Freud and other psychologists and psychoanalysts to kind of like build off of what their work to kind of lay the groundwork for solitude being an important part of people's lives. So it was interesting. I feel like because it's a little bit dated, there may be some things that are more recent that would also be maybe more helpful to read. All right, next up, I read a book called All Roads Lead Here by Mariana Zapata. I've been working through this author's backlist. She's one of my favorite romance authors. And I have read recent books by her in the past that are more like sports-themed romance. This is not a sports-themed romance. It is about a woman who basically goes to this small town where when she was younger in her life, her mother went hiking there and went missing. And she comes back to this small town. She's had kind of like a emotional kind of like breakup that also impacted her career. And she's just trying to kind of like reset basically in her life. And she goes to rent a home, like kind of like an Airbnb. And when she gets there, she realizes that the man who owns the home, his teenage son has rented it out without telling him. And so they allow her to stay there. But it starts out as definitely kind of like a grumpy like sunshine trope and not like enemies to lovers, but definitely like grumpy sunshine. And I really love how Mariana Zapata writes romance. I love that she has all of these different side characters and family characters that she brings in. There's a lot of really fun elements here about how this woman is trying to kind of like rebuild her life back. She gets a different job. She starts going on, like hikes and like really trying to learn about like a whole different industry than where she originally came out of. And she's also kind of like getting over this relationship that was a long-term relationship for her. I would recommend any of Mariana Zapata's books. I'm still working my way through her backlist, but this was one that I really enjoyed. Next up, I read a book called Normal Sucks by Jonathan Mooney. And this is part of like a side project that I'm working on right now. I'm reading a lot of books on neurodiversity for a project that I'm working on with my side business where I do coach training. And so I have this whole stack of books. You will probably start to see them showing up in my reading videos. But this is a book that is basically about the author's experience growing up with a kind of a learning disability. He identifies as having ADHD. And he was basically put in a situation where he was told to kind of limit his capacity. And he is pushing back on that and kind of saying like how we define normal. And he goes through like this historical account of like all these different disciplines and how we've defined normal over time, that it's really problematic and it's not allowing for difference to be kind of recognized as a positive thing. He has a couple other books that I like immediately went out and bought because I think that it's just a really interesting approach. And then the next book that I read is also along the same vein. It's called ADHD for Smartass Women by Tracy Otsuka. And this is a book basically talking about how ADHD can show up differently for women than how it typically shows up for men or boys. Kind of historically, when we have defined both ADD and ADHD, it's usually been around young boys and how it presents, but it looks very different for women. And so this is a book that kind of goes into more detail about that, and I found it fascinating. Okay, the next book that I read is called The Expectant Detectives. It's the first book in the Expectant Detectives series by Kat Ailes. And this is a book that is basically about a pregnant woman and her partner who move to a small town. And then there is a dead body that shows up in this small town. And she is getting embroiled in like solving this mystery with a number of like side characters that she becomes kind of aligned with, people that like live around her. And this was a very charming book. I think that I don't typically read this kind of mystery. It's a little bit more of like a cozy mystery, but I thought that it hung together pretty well. I'm not sure if this is this author's first book, just because it's the first book in this series. But I would definitely potentially pick up another book in this series. I just thought it was kind of cute, and I liked where it went in the end. I thought it was an interesting way to wrap up the book. Okay, next up I read a book called The Idea of You by Robin Lee. This is a romance novel that is also being adapted into a film that just came out. And the basic premise of this is there is a woman who is in her early 40s, I think she's 40 or 39, and she goes with her daughter, who's 13 years old or an adolescent, to this concert of a boy band. And when they're at this concert, they have these like backstage passes, and she meets one of the members of the band, and he's kind of taken with her, and he's 20 years old, and they basically begin to have a romance. And this is basically a novel about their development of this relationship, and then what ultimately happens as they are dealing with kind of his fame and a lot of critiques basically about their age difference and the relationship. I definitely will watch the film adaptation of this. I'm really curious. I've heard it's a little bit different than the book. I will say I read this in almost one sitting because I was just kind of like pulled in and I wanted to know where it was going to go. And I don't know that I'll pick up other books by this author necessarily. I think that this one was very kind of unique in its premise, and I was definitely interested in the adaptation. But I would take a look and see what else she's done. The next book I picked up is the 6th book in the Karen Pirie series, which I already talked about in this video. It's called Still Life. And again, this is the book about this is the series about the cold cases and the detective. This is the second to last book in the series as of right now. The author is still, I think, actively writing the series. So I have one more book to pick up. Hopefully I'll get to it next month before I wrap up that series. The next book that I picked up is a book called Ready or Not by Kara Bastone. And this is a book that is about a surprise pregnancy and a woman who is kind of dealing with this surprise pregnancy, which is with kind of like a one-night stand and someone that she's not expecting to have a continued relationship with. But she does have this like childhood best friend, and her childhood best friend, of course, has a brother, and the brother is starting to kind of support her in the situation that she's in. And this is a book that I enjoyed a lot. There's another book that is also about kind of a surprise pregnancy that I read either this year or last year called Out on a Limb that I like better. So I will say, if this is like a trope, some people like this kind of surprise pregnancy trope and some people really don't. I've often seen like a really mixed bag of reviews, but generally reviews for this book seem pretty positive. The other book, Out on a Limb, author's first name is Hannah. I'll put a cover on the video so you can see the book I'm talking about. But that one is also basically a pregnancy resulting from a one-night stand and the relationship that results from that. And both of those books I would recommend, but Out on a Limb is winning just a little bit there for me. The next book that I read is called The Comfort Crisis by Michael Easter. Subtitle is Embrace Discomfort to Reclaim Your Wild, Happy, Healthy Self. And this is a book that has gotten really good reviews. Like it was scored pretty high on Goodreads, and so I was really curious about it. And basically, it is about a man who is talking about mostly like kind of like physical and mental challenges and how you should kind of push yourself to your limits in order to further embrace comfort in your life. And so, for example, there's a large portion of the book that talks about this hunting trip that he goes on with a couple of like friends of his, and they get dumped into like literally the middle of nowhere. And I think it's somewhere in Alaska, and they have to do basically like their own like survival, camping, and then they're hunting, and then they have to like carry 100 pounds of like elk meat for like miles. And he talks about all of these kind of like physical challenges that people assign to themselves. And the idea is to basically pick something where you could fail because it's so difficult for you to do. I actually found this to be really interesting in terms of the kinds of examples that he was giving. I don't know that I'm necessarily going to choose to do what he was describing in this book, but I did find it interesting, like the concept of kind of pushing yourself beyond your limits. The next book that I picked up is a book called The Graham Effect. This is the first book in the Campus Diaries series by Elle Kennedy. This is a book that is about a hockey, I think it's about two hockey players. I'm just reminding myself. I know the male is a hockey player. I think, yeah, the female main character is also a hockey player. This book reminded me a lot of Icebreaker, which is another book that I read about kind of hockey and figure skating and being on a college campus. They all kind of run together for me, I will say. I thought this book was fine. I will definitely probably read other books by this author in the future, but I didn't necessarily feel like this was something that stood out to me in any particular kind of way. All right, so the next couple of books that I read, these are the ones that I read when I was a little bit under the weather. So one of them is a reread. It is called All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. The first time that I read this book, let me see if I can see, was in 2016, so almost like 8 years ago. And I decided to pick this up again. Basically, this is about a female main character who lives in Paris. And when she is 12, the Nazis occupy Paris, and they flee to kind of this other area where they're supposed to be more safe with her uncle. And she happens to be blind. And then there's a second character, a male character, who is an orphan who kind of grows up to then enlist. And he is supposed to be tracking down the resistance. And so she's kind of on one side and he's on the other side of this war. And I will say that I would want to read this book again. It's a really good book. It's definitely an award-winning book. I think this book might have won a Pulitzer Prize, and I remember loving it the first time around. The reason I wanted to read it the second time is because it's been adapted into a television show, and so I wanted to revisit it. But I will say I feel like I was a little bit out of it when I was reading that particular book. The second book that I was a little bit out of as I was reading is called The Sword of Kaigen by M.L. Wang. And this is a book that I've heard really, really good things about. And I feel like the thing that I can say about it is, like, structurally, it's very interesting because you have a mother character that, like, she used to be kind of a warrior, and then she gets married and kind of like sets that part of her life aside. And then a situation happens in her town, and her son is kind of being swept up into, this situation, and he's being like trained in a particular kind of way. And it's kind of going back and forth between like their storylines and also like her past. There's characters that kind of come in from the side that like knew her when she was a warrior. This book, I would say I could probably revisit again because I was a little bit out of it when I was reading it. Definitely in kind of like a fevered flu virus headspace. But generally, I thought it was interesting, and I feel like it's definitely more traditional in its kind of like fantasy components versus like some of the more contemporary things that you might read. This one felt definitely more traditional to me. So for people who like more traditional fantasy, I might recommend this more than if you're more interested in more like contemporary fantasy tropes. Last couple books that I read in the month of April. One is called Widen the Window Training Your Brain and Body to Thrive During Stress and Recover from Trauma. This is by Elizabeth Stanley. This is a book that I read for a couple of reasons. One is because I'm interested in kind of trauma-informed theories for coaching. And also because I'm just personally interested in kind of resilience literature and how I can apply it into my own life. One of the things that I found helpful with this book is there are moments where the author kind of pauses and says, like, now apply what I've been telling you into your own experience and like take a moment to kind of reflect or journal about like these particular things. I wouldn't say it's like a workbook style, but it definitely has kind of elements of like asking you to reflect and apply, which I did find helpful because there are elements of this book that I would say are definitely pulling in kind of like psychological elements and different theories that may not be familiar to most readers who are digging into this book. The last book that I read in the month of April is a book called The Trail of Lost Hearts by Tracy Garvis Graves. And this is a book that I found to be also very charming. So basically you have a female main character in her mid-30s who is dealing with a kind of like a grief situation. I don't want to give away too much, but basically she has a person that she has been with romantically who dies. And there's kind of some things that unfold about what has happened, in that relationship. But she is grieving that situation, and she decides that she's going to go on this like geocaching journey. And relatively early in the book, she's doing a geocache and she gets interrupted by some kind of unsavory characters on the trail. And she ends up partnering up with this other man who is a psychologist. And they start to do the geocaching together because she's feeling some concerns about her safety as she's going about all these different geocaching locations. And so this is a really interesting book, first of all, about geocaching, because like I didn't know a ton about it, and there's some kind of fun facts about that. I also think it's a great book about just kind of this blooming relationship between these two adults who both have their own kind of like pain and baggage that they're bringing into this adult relationship together. So overall, I just found this to be really fun. I don't think this is an author that I've read before, but I would definitely look up other books that she has written and see if there's anything that I might enjoy. So those are all the books that I read in the month of April. I would also love to hear what you read this past month. Feel free to drop in a comment below, and stay tuned for my video about the books that I hope to read in the month of May. Until the next video, happy reading.